I never thought the person I built my future with would be the person I needed to protect it from. My name is Michael Bennett, and for 18 years, I believed I understood my marriage better than anyone else. Rachel and I had built a life together in Colorado that looked like the kind of life many people hope to have. We owned a comfortable home, had steady careers, and created a savings plan for the future we always talked about. We were not perfect, but I believed we were partners. I owned a small construction company, which meant my days were often filled with deadlines, employees, and responsibilities. Rachel worked in financial management, and she was always the person who reminded me to think ahead. She was organized, careful, and always prepared for unexpected situations. For years, I admired that about her. I trusted her judgment because she had always shown me that she cared about creating stability for our family. Looking back now, I realize that the biggest warning signs were not dramatic moments. They were small changes that were easy to explain away. Rachel started asking more questions about our savings account. She became more interested in details about our finances than she had been before. Conversations about our future started sounding different. She would mention ideas about independence and preparing for different possibilities, but I never imagined those conversations were connected to our marriage. I assumed she was simply being practical. After nearly 2 decades together, you do not immediately question the person who has shared your life, your memories, and your dreams. You give them the benefit of the doubt because trust is built over thousands of ordinary moments. That trust was exactly why what happened next was so difficult for me to understand. One morning, while I was reviewing business expenses at my office, I received a notification from our bank. At first, I barely paid attention. I thought it was just another routine update. But when I opened it and looked closer, something felt wrong. There were signs of attempted transfers from our shared savings account that I did not recognize. I stared at the information on the screen, trying to convince myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe Rachel had forgotten to tell me something. Maybe there was a misunderstanding. I wanted that to be true because the alternative was something I was not ready to accept. The person connected to those decisions was not a stranger. It was my wife. The woman I had trusted for 18 years had started making financial moves that affected both of us without having a conversation with me first. In that moment, I realized this was never just about money. The savings account was only the thing that revealed a much deeper problem. The real issue was that somewhere along the way, Rachel and I had stopped sharing important parts of our lives with each other. I did not immediately confront her because I knew emotions could make things worse. I needed to understand what was happening before making any decisions. I needed facts, not assumptions. I needed to know whether this was a misunderstanding or something much bigger. What I did not know was that Rachel had already been preparing for a future I had never been told about. After discovering the unusual activity connected to our savings account, I spent the next few days trying to understand what was really happening. The hardest part was not seeing the financial information. The hardest part was accepting that Rachel had been thinking about something this important without sharing it with me. I kept asking myself the same questions over and over. When did things change between us? How long had she been feeling this way? And why did she believe she had to make plans without telling me? I did not want to assume the worst about my wife. 18 years of marriage meant something to me. We had been through career changes, family responsibilities, unexpected expenses, and countless ordinary days that became memories. I could not simply erase all of that because of one discovery. So instead of reacting emotionally, I started paying closer attention. I looked back at the months before I received that bank notification and noticed things I had previously ignored. Rachel had become more careful about certain conversations. She would ask about our financial situation, but she rarely shared why she wanted to know specific details. She started talking more about having options and being prepared for unexpected changes. At the time, I thought she was simply being responsible. After all, Rachel had always been the planner in our relationship. She believed in having backup plans and making sure we were ready for challenges. But now those same qualities looked different to me. I began wondering if she had been preparing for a possibility that I was not aware of. I decided not to confront her immediately because I wanted to understand the full picture first. I did not want our first serious conversation to become an argument filled with accusations. I wanted to know the truth. So I quietly organized the information I had and reviewed our financial situation carefully. I checked records, looked at timelines, and tried to understand what steps had already been taken. What I discovered was that Rachel had not made these decisions overnight. She had been thinking about our future for some time. That realization was difficult because it meant this was not just a moment of confusion. It was something she had been considering privately. The strange thing was that part of me was hurt, but another part of me wanted to understand her reasons. I knew Rachel was not someone who made major choices without thought. There had to be something behind her actions. There had to be a reason she felt the need to protect herself. That did not mean I agreed with how she handled things, but I wanted to understand what was happening in her mind. I also started looking honestly at my own role in our marriage. Had I been too focused on work? Had I spent so much time building financial security that I forgot to ask how Rachel was feeling? Had we both become so comfortable with our routine that we stopped having meaningful conversations? Those questions were uncomfortable, but they were necessary. I realized that if I only focused on the money, I would miss the bigger issue. The savings account was only a symptom. The real problem was the distance that had grown between us. I knew I needed to talk to Rachel soon, but before I did, I needed to be prepared. Because the next conversation we had would reveal whether this was only about finances or if there was a much deeper problem in our marriage. The more I learned about Rachel's actions, the more I realized that I was looking at my marriage from a completely different perspective. Before this happened, I believed I knew the person I had spent 18 years with. I knew Rachel's habits, her personality, and the way she approached problems. But now I was discovering that there was a part of her thoughts and fears that I had never truly seen. That realization was painful, but it was also important. I did not want to create a story in my head where Rachel was simply the person who caused a problem. I knew there had to be more behind her decisions. So I continued looking for answers, not because I wanted to prove she was wrong, but because I needed to understand what had brought us to this point. As I reviewed everything, I noticed a pattern. Rachel had not been preparing for one specific moment. She had been preparing for uncertainty. She had looked into our finances, considered different possibilities, and started thinking about what her future might look like if our marriage changed. The difficult part was realizing that while she was planning for a possible future without me, I was still believing we were working toward the same future together. We were standing in the same house, living the same life, but we were seeing completely different realities. That feeling stayed with me because it was not just about financial decisions. It was about trust. I wondered how many conversations we had avoided that could have prevented this situation. I thought about the times Rachel seemed distant and the moments when I was too busy to ask what was really going on. I had always considered myself a responsible husband. I worked hard, paid attention to our finances, and tried to create a stable life. But I started realizing that responsibility is not only about providing security. It is also about making sure the person beside you feels heard and understood. Still, I knew I could not ignore what happened. Understanding Rachel's feelings did not mean pretending her choices had no impact on me. Both things could exist at the same time. She could have fears about the future, and I could still feel hurt that she handled those fears without including me. That balance became important as I prepared to speak with her. I did not want a confrontation. I wanted a real conversation. I wanted to hear her side, but I also needed her to understand mine. Before talking to Rachel, I took practical steps to make sure I was prepared. I organized our financial information, reviewed our shared accounts, and made sure I understood exactly what was happening. I was not trying to punish her or create a bigger conflict. I simply did not want to walk into an important conversation without knowing the facts. For the first time in years, I stopped assuming that everything would work itself out. I started paying attention. I started asking questions. And I started accepting that the relationship I thought I understood might have problems that had been hidden for much longer than I realized. The hardest part was knowing that soon I would have to sit across from Rachel and ask the question I had been avoiding. Why did my wife feel like she had to prepare for a future without me? The hardest conversation of my life was not difficult because I was afraid of what Rachel might say. It was difficult because I knew that whatever happened next would change the way we looked at our marriage forever. For days, I had been trying to understand the situation from every angle. I had reviewed the financial information, thought about our past conversations, and accepted that there were problems between us that we had both ignored for too long. But understanding something privately is very different from sitting across from the person you love and talking about it openly. One evening, after we had both finished our usual routines, I asked Rachel if we could talk. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse her of anything. I simply told her that I knew about the financial decisions she had been making and that I wanted to understand why. The expression on her face changed immediately. For a moment, she looked surprised, almost as if she did not expect me to know. Then that surprise turned into something else. It looked like a mixture of worry, sadness, and relief. I think part of her had been carrying the weight of those decisions alone, and part of her was relieved that she no longer had to hide what she had been thinking about. We sat together in our living room, the same place where we had spent years watching movies, talking about our plans, and sharing ordinary moments. But that night felt different. The room was familiar, yet the conversation made it feel like we were meeting each other in a completely new way. I started by telling Rachel that I was hurt, not because she wanted to protect herself, but because she made decisions about our shared future without allowing me to be part of the conversation. I explained that after 18 years together, feeling excluded was painful. I wanted her to understand that my concern was not only about the savings account. It was about what her actions represented. Rachel listened quietly before finally explaining her side. She told me that she had not planned everything because she wanted to hurt me. She said she had been feeling uncertain about our relationship for a long time and did not know how to express those feelings. She admitted that she had started thinking about what she would do if our marriage reached a point where we could not move forward together. Hearing that was difficult, but it also helped me understand that this situation was more complicated than I originally believed. Rachel was not simply trying to take control. She was trying to feel secure in a future that she was afraid might change. That did not erase the fact that she handled things without me, but it helped me see the emotions behind her choices. I also shared my own feelings. I told her that I wished she had trusted me enough to have that conversation earlier. I told her that protecting herself did not have to mean preparing in silence. A marriage requires two people facing uncertainty together, not two people separately creating their own plans. For the first time in months, we stopped talking about the financial issue and started talking about the real problem. We talked about the distance that had grown between us, the conversations we avoided, and the moments when we both felt alone. That night did not fix everything. It did not erase the hurt or instantly rebuild our trust. But it did something important. It opened a door that had been closed for a long time. And through that conversation, I realized the situation was never only about money. It was about two people who had forgotten how to truly communicate. After the conversation with Rachel, I expected to feel more certain about what would happen next. Instead, I realized that understanding the truth was only the beginning. For the first time in a long time, we had both stopped avoiding the difficult parts of our relationship. We admitted that there were problems, but admitting them did not automatically solve them. The days that followed were filled with conversations we should have had years earlier. We talked about the moments when we both felt disconnected, the choices we made without explaining our thoughts, and the assumptions we had created about each other. What surprised me was realizing that we had both been trying to protect the marriage in our own ways. I focused on providing stability. Rachel focused on preparing for uncertainty. The problem was that we were both making decisions based on our fears instead of working through those fears together. I spent a lot of time thinking about the moment I discovered the attempted transfers. At first, I saw it as the moment Rachel broke my trust. But as I listened to her explain what she had been feeling, I started seeing a bigger picture. She had not suddenly changed into a different person. She was someone who had been carrying worries quietly for a long time. That did not mean I agreed with how she handled the situation. It meant I understood that her actions came from emotions that had been building for years. At the same time, Rachel began to understand my side more clearly. She realized that the financial decisions were not just about numbers on a screen. They represented a choice to move forward without including me. She admitted that she had been so focused on protecting herself that she did not fully consider how isolated I would feel. Hearing that mattered because it showed me she was not just defending her actions. She was trying to understand the impact they had on me. Slowly, our conversations started changing. We stopped asking who was right and started asking what needed to change. That was a major difference. For a long time, we had both approached problems like we were trying to avoid losing. Now we were trying to understand how we had both contributed to the distance between us. I also had to be honest with myself. I had spent years believing that working hard and creating financial security was enough. I thought my actions showed love because I was always trying to build a stable future. But I realized that a person can provide everything practical and still miss what their partner needs emotionally. Rachel did not only need security. She needed to feel heard. She needed to feel like we were facing life together. That was something I should have noticed earlier. We started making small changes. We discussed financial decisions openly. We talked about future plans before they became worries. We stopped assuming we already knew what the other person was thinking. These changes did not happen overnight, but they created a different atmosphere between us. The strange thing was that the savings account conflict, which originally felt like it could destroy everything we had built, became the reason we finally started having honest conversations. I realized that the biggest danger to our marriage was never the money. It was the silence that existed before the money became an issue. But as we began rebuilding communication, I knew there was still one important question we had to answer. Could we rebuild enough trust to move forward, or had this situation revealed a problem that was too deep to overcome? The weeks after Rachel and I finally talked honestly about our situation were some of the most challenging and meaningful weeks of our marriage. For the first time in a long time, we were no longer pretending that everything was fine. We had stopped avoiding difficult conversations, and that allowed us to see problems we had ignored for years. I used to believe that a strong marriage meant protecting each other from stress by handling problems quietly. But I began to understand that keeping things hidden, even with good intentions, can create distance between two people. Rachel and I were learning that honesty was not always comfortable, but it was necessary. One of the biggest changes was the way we approached our finances. Before everything happened, we both had our own assumptions about money. I believed that because I worked hard and helped build our financial stability, we were already on the same page. Rachel believed that having a backup plan gave her a sense of security. Neither of us realized that those different approaches were creating a gap between us. We started reviewing our financial decisions together. We talked about our savings, our future goals, and what each of us needed to feel secure. Those conversations were not about controlling each other. They were about making sure both of us felt included. It was a simple change, but it made a huge difference. Rachel also opened up more about the fears she had been carrying. She explained that she was not only worried about money. She was worried about uncertainty, about change, and about feeling like she had no control over her own future. Listening to her helped me understand that her actions came from a place of fear rather than a desire to hurt me. At the same time, she understood that my reaction was not only about the savings account. It was about feeling like the person I trusted most had made a major decision without me. We both had emotions that were real, and both of us needed to acknowledge that. I also had to look honestly at my own behavior. I realized that I had been so focused on being responsible that I sometimes forgot to be emotionally available. I spent years thinking that providing a stable home and managing responsibilities was the clearest way to show love. But Rachel needed more than stability. She needed connection. She needed conversations. She needed to know that her thoughts mattered. That realization changed the way I viewed our relationship. I stopped thinking about trust as something that either existed or disappeared. I started seeing trust as something that needed constant attention. Every honest conversation, every shared decision, and every moment of listening became a small step toward rebuilding what we had lost. There were still difficult days. There were moments when memories of the situation returned and reminded me how close we had come to losing something important. But instead of allowing those feelings to create more distance, we used them as reminders to communicate better. Slowly, the fear that had surrounded our relationship started to fade. The situation that began with secrecy was now leading us toward more openness than we had experienced in years. I realized that protecting a marriage is not about making sure problems never happen. Problems will always appear. The real test is whether two people are willing to face those problems together. Rachel and I were still figuring things out, but for the first time in a long time, we were finally moving in the same direction. As Rachel and I continued working through everything that had happened, I began to understand that rebuilding trust was not about forgetting the past. It was about learning from it. There was a time when I thought moving forward meant leaving the situation behind and never talking about it again. But I realized that ignoring what happened would only create the same distance that caused the problem in the first place. We needed to understand the reasons behind our choices, not just the choices themselves. One of the most important changes was that we started becoming more intentional about our communication. Before everything happened, we often talked about schedules, bills, and daily responsibilities, but we rarely talked about what we were feeling. We were good at managing life, but we had forgotten how to connect with each other. That was something both Rachel and I had to admit. We had spent years solving practical problems while ignoring emotional ones. Rachel started sharing more about her thoughts instead of keeping them to herself. She told me when she felt uncertain, when she felt overwhelmed, and when she needed reassurance. For someone who had always tried to handle things independently, that was a major change for her. I could see that opening up was not easy, but I also saw that she was making an effort. That mattered to me because trust is rebuilt through actions, not just words. I also worked on changing my own habits. I learned that listening was sometimes more important than immediately trying to solve a problem. My instinct had always been to find solutions. That was how I approached my business, and for a long time, I approached my marriage the same way. But relationships are not business decisions. Sometimes people do not need an answer right away. Sometimes they need to feel understood first. That lesson changed the way I interacted with Rachel. Instead of asking, "How do we fix this?" I started asking, "How did we get here?" That simple change created better conversations between us. We began looking at our marriage from a different perspective. We realized that the financial situation was not the beginning of our problems. It was the moment that exposed problems that already existed. The lack of communication, the assumptions, and the emotional distance had been building slowly over time. Neither of us noticed it because we were both focused on our own responsibilities. Rachel was focused on creating security. I was focused on providing stability. We were both trying to protect our future, but we were doing it separately instead of together. That realization was difficult because it meant neither of us could simply blame the other person. We both had a role in creating the distance between us. But accepting responsibility also gave us the opportunity to change. We started making decisions together again. Small things became important. Discussing plans before making choices. Checking in with each other after difficult days. Taking time to talk without distractions. These moments seemed simple, but they slowly rebuilt the connection we had lost. I no longer saw Rachel as someone who had threatened everything we built. I saw her as someone who had been struggling with fears she did not know how to express. Rachel also started seeing me differently. She understood that my desire to protect our finances came from wanting security, not control. We were finally seeing each other clearly again. The situation that had once made me question whether our marriage could survive was now teaching us how to create a healthier relationship. But I knew one important decision was still ahead of us. Understanding each other was the first step. Choosing what we would do with that understanding would determine our future. The biggest lesson Rachel and I learned was that a relationship cannot survive on assumptions. For years, we both believed we understood what the other person needed, but we were often making decisions based on our own perspective. I thought providing stability was enough. Rachel thought preparing for uncertainty was the best way to protect herself. The truth was that we were both trying to create security, but we were building it in separate directions. After everything we experienced, we knew we had to make a choice about the future of our marriage. We could continue looking at the past and keep reminding ourselves of the hurt, or we could use what happened as a reason to create something better. That decision was not simple. Trust does not return just because two people have one honest conversation. It takes time, patience, and consistency. There were still moments when I remembered the uncertainty I felt when I discovered what was happening. There were still moments when Rachel struggled with feeling guilty about how she handled things. But instead of allowing those emotions to separate us, we learned how to talk about them. That was the difference between our old relationship and our new one. Before, difficult conversations felt like threats. Now, they became opportunities to understand each other. We also made practical changes that reflected the lessons we had learned. We created a clearer approach to our finances where both of us were involved in decisions. We discussed goals together instead of assuming we wanted the same things. We started planning for the future as partners again. These changes were not dramatic, but they were meaningful because they showed that we were both willing to participate. Rachel told me something that stayed with me. She said that for a long time, she believed protecting herself meant making sure she could handle anything alone. But she realized that being in a marriage meant allowing someone else to stand beside her, not keeping them at a distance. Hearing that helped me understand her in a way I had not before. I also shared something important with her. I admitted that I had spent years believing that if I worked hard enough, everything would be okay. I focused so much on building a secure life that I sometimes forgot to slow down and ask whether we were emotionally connected. We both had things to learn. We both had areas where we needed to grow. The experience changed the way I viewed trust. I used to think trust meant believing someone would never make a mistake. Now I understand that trust means knowing both people are willing to face mistakes honestly and work through them together. A strong relationship is not created because problems never happen. It is created because two people choose to handle problems with respect and honesty. Looking back, I realize the most important moment was not when I discovered the financial issue. It was when Rachel and I finally stopped protecting ourselves from each other and started working together again. The situation that once felt like the beginning of the end became the reason we finally addressed the problems we had ignored. We were not the same couple we were before, but in some ways, that was a good thing. We were more aware, more honest, and more willing to communicate. Still, one final lesson remained. I had to decide what I would carry with me from this experience and what I would leave behind. When I look back at everything that happened, I no longer see that difficult period as the moment my marriage almost ended. I see it as the moment Rachel and I finally faced the problems we had avoided for years. At the beginning, I thought the situation was only about money. I believed the biggest issue was the financial decisions that were made without me. But over time, I realized the savings account was only the place where our deeper problems became visible. The real issue was trust, communication, and the distance that had slowly grown between two people who once shared everything. Rachel and I had spent years building a life together. We had a home in Colorado, careers we were proud of, and countless memories that could not be erased by one difficult chapter. But we also learned that a long history together does not automatically guarantee a strong future. A relationship requires attention every day. It requires honesty, patience, and the willingness to listen even when the truth is uncomfortable. One of the biggest changes in me was understanding that protecting myself did not mean shutting someone else out. When I first discovered what was happening, my instinct was to focus on preventing more uncertainty. I wanted to make sure I was prepared and that important decisions were handled responsibly. That was necessary, but I later understood that protection alone could not rebuild a relationship. Trust could only return through communication and understanding. Rachel also changed. She learned that independence and partnership do not have to compete with each other. She could have concerns, fears, and personal goals while still sharing them with the person beside her. She realized that preparing for the future did not require creating a future alone. We both learned that a marriage is not about one person being right and the other person being wrong. It is about two people recognizing when they have lost their connection and deciding whether they are willing to find it again. Today, when I think about that moment, I remember the uncertainty I felt, but I also remember what came after. I remember the conversations we finally had. I remember the honesty that replaced silence. I remember realizing that the person sitting across from me was not my enemy. She was someone who had been struggling with her own fears, just as I had been struggling with my own assumptions. That understanding changed everything. I do not believe every relationship can be repaired after trust is damaged. Every situation is different, and every person has to decide what is right for their own life. But I do believe that people deserve the chance to have honest conversations before making permanent decisions based only on fear. The experience taught me that money can reveal problems, but it cannot define the value of a relationship. The most important things we built together were never stored in a bank account. They were the years of memories, the lessons we learned, and the effort we chose to make after things became difficult. Rachel and I are still human. We still have disagreements. We still have moments where we need to communicate better. But now we approach those moments differently. We face them together instead of separately. And that is the lesson I carry forward. Sometimes the biggest threat to a relationship is not the problem itself. It is the silence that allows the problem to grow. When two people are willing to be honest, listen, and choose each other again, even a painful chapter can become the beginning of something stronger.